The nation's largest landowner, the federal government, manages 500 million acres under the Department of the Interior. And while some expect that America's public lands are managed for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, others say the Trump administration has allowed interests like energy development to lead land policy. This is Trump on Earth. I'm Julie Grant. Trump's first Interior Secretary, Ryan Zinke, literally rode into Washington on a horse a couple of years ago, promising to be a land steward in the style of President Theodore Roosevelt. More recently, he signed his resignation letter in a now infamous, barely legible, chunky red pen. With us to talk about Zinke's legacy and what it means for the country's public lands is Collin O'Mara. He's president of the National Wildlife Federation and wrote an opinion piece about Zinke in the Washington Post. Hi, Collin.
Julie, thanks for having me on today.
So, as the National Wildlife Federation, what do you see as the government's role in managing public lands?
America is blessed with incredible public lands. They really are the envy of the world. You look at the natural treasures, whether that's our national parks, our national forests, our incredible national wildlife refuges. They are unrivaled around the world, and the wildlife they hold, the special places that they contain, really are just magnificent. And the tradition going back to Theodore Roosevelt is that they should be managed for the enjoyment and benefit of all the people, as you said at the top. And our expectation is that they're managed for these multiple purposes. They're managed for wildlife, they're managed for water, they're managed for recreation, they're managed for development, in some cases responsibly done. But there has to be a balance. And what we saw with this administration so far is that the energy development agenda that they've promoted basically came at the expense of all those other values that I mentioned.
Yeah, so initially, National Wildlife Federation endorsed President Trump's nominee, Ryan Zinke, for Department of Interior Secretary. Why? Initially, what were you thinking?
When the secretary position was kind of being discussed, several of the candidates that they were discussing were folks that had very strong ties to the oil and gas industry, and a history of, in one case, former Governor Palin was one of the names that was being bandied about.
And we'll drill for the billions of barrels of oil that we have right now, warehoused.
And she obviously led those famous chants about "Drill, baby, drill" down at the 2008 convention.
And drill now, and now's when you chant "Drill, baby, drill." Yes.
And so of all the nominees that they were talking about, the only one that had a bit of a track record as a legislator on conservation issues was Ryan Zinke. And so even though we had kind of high hopes because he had been a supporter of things like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, he had been a supporter of keeping public lands public and not selling them off to the states, at the end of the day, he ended up kind of not fulfilling the promises that he made to make sure that the full mission of the department and those other conservation and recreation values were given the same footing as the oil and gas priorities that he was charged with.
Yeah, so can you take us through a little bit what happened during his tenure? When did you start seeing, wait a minute, this isn't what we had hoped, this isn't what we expected from Ryan Zinke in this position? So
during his confirmation hearings, he talked a lot about Theodore Roosevelt's legacy.
And up front, I'm a Teddy Roosevelt guy. Teddy Roosevelt had the courage 100 years ago. The reorganization is going to be bold and look at just as Teddy Roosevelt did.
But if you look at what happened in the first 100 days, the first 300 days of his tenure, the driving priority behind it was the implementation of an executive order that President Trump signed around energy dominance.
I guess they like what we're about to sign.
We saw a range of activities. We saw the largest reduction in protected land in American history.
President Trump traveled to Utah today, where he dramatically cut back the size of 2 national monuments in that state. It fulfills
an 85% reduction of the 1.3 million acre Bears Ears National Monument, a 50% reduction in the nearly 2 million acres of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, both in Utah.
I've come to Utah to take a very historic action to reverse federal overreach and restore the rights of this land.
Trump's moves are welcome in much of rural America, especially in western states where the federal government is the biggest landowner.
We saw a range of rules being withdrawn for things like making sure that gas pipelines aren't leaking, to make sure that offshore oil drilling is done more effectively, that when development does occur, it's done in places where you minimize the impact. Those rules were withdrawn.
Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke called the effort to reduce permit times for energy leases on federal land an example of, quote, good government, and will further support the president's goal of American energy dominance.
In each of these cases, they were things that industry had asked for.
I want to thank all of our industry leaders who are with us.
And nearly every single one of them that was enacted came at the expense of conservation.
That is what this is all about, bringing back our jobs, bringing back our dreams, and making America wealthy again.
But I think there's probably no better example of this kind of energy dominance strategy than his decision last year to propose opening up every single coastal water, with very, very few exceptions, around the entire North American continent.
President Trump signed an executive order encouraging more drilling rights in federal waters to help the U.S. achieve energy dominance. Well, now
the proposal lifts a ban imposed by President Obama. It gives the energy industry access to drilling rights in most parts of the Pacific and in the Atlantic near Maine and the eastern Gulf of Mexico. Interior Secretary
again, no nuance and really just no forethought given to the conservation implications of that. And as a result, you saw governors of both parties, particularly on the Atlantic coast, overwhelmingly oppose those actions. And so whether it was conservation interests or interests of the tribes, and the case of some of the national monuments being reduced, or other constituencies that obviously have a huge interest in a balanced, well-managed Department of the Interior, you saw all of those interests always being subjugated below the interest of the energy industry.
So I guess your hopes for him had been dashed pretty early there.
They had, unfortunately. I mean, I think, look, we're a bipartisan group. We have 6 million members. The National Wildlife Federation has affiliates in all 50 states and territories. About 40% of our members are Republicans. I mean, so we really do try to work with everybody. One of the things that was interesting to us is that as much as we were pushing hard at the beginning, trying to have more balance, the Secretary himself acknowledged last March that he needed to pivot towards conservation. He acknowledged that there was not much focus on conservation in the first year. I mean, they had opened up a few national wildlife refuges for additional recreational activities. But beyond that, most of the bigger initiatives that they've laid out on the conservation side really came late in the tenure, as he was trying to have more balance, things around trying to have more focus on wildlife migration corridors for elk and mule deer and pronghorn, trying to have more relationships with the states and trying to do more proactive collaborative work. But when you look at you kind of tally up the sum of his tenure, there's obviously a lot more in the work that he did that was supporting kind of deregulating the energy industry and allowing significant more extraction of natural resources compared to the few things that he did on the conservation side of the ledger.
Yeah, so could we look at sort of some of the proposals and things that were out there and what's actually happened on the ground because of those initiatives? For example, you mentioned the shrinking of the national monuments in Utah, Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante. That actually happened. That wasn't just a proposal. So what does that mean on the ground?
Bears Ears is a perfect example of kind of the rhetoric from the campaign not matching the kind of reality of what he experienced. I mean, the president himself during the campaign talked about conservation being important. There's a kind of a famous speech in North Carolina where he talked about Roosevelt's vision. The secretary obviously talked about that a lot in the confirmation process as well as kind of early remarks. And the Antiquities Act, which was actually passed into law by Theodore Roosevelt, was the statutory basis for actually the president for President Obama creating the Bears Ears National Monument. Now, this is an area of land in southern Utah that is absolutely spectacular. It's got incredible geologic formations. You have important wildlife habitat corridors. You have important cultural artifacts, and so it's an area that has been worthy of protection for decades. And, the president in Utah announced that he was going to reduce the size of this national monument by 85%, so by more than 1 million acres. And at the time they said that, well, this isn't about, energy development.
We also have a pretty good idea of certainly the oil and gas potential, not much. So Bears Ears isn't really about oil and gas at all.
And the truth is that there's significant uranium resources there. There's also significant interest in some oil and gas and a couple of the corner pieces of the area. But if you look at the way the maps were drawn and where the reductions occurred and where the protections were removed, they're almost entirely in areas where there are significant either fossil fuel or uranium assets, mining the different minerals to be mined. And so, again, I mean, it's a perfect example of how, again, the energy agenda took absolute precedence over the conservation agenda at a time when, especially on the oil and gas side, prices are fairly low. A lot of these areas, there's not a shortage right now of any of these fuels. If anything, we need to be reducing them given the climate challenges we're facing.
Are we already seeing that move forward? Are we seeing uranium mining happening in areas that otherwise would have been protected?
So we've already seen the leasing process. So folks are acquiring leases. They're going through the process of kind of doing the permitting. And so we could see activity, in the next year.
Did you somehow feel, like that you'd been lied to, or that that this was a betrayal of trust?
We try not to question people's motives, but we would rather just have folks be completely honest about what their motivation is. I mean, in this case, they talked about they wanted to return it to the people. They question whether or not there was local public support for the designation. I mean, the tribes have been overwhelmingly supportive of protecting these assets for decades. I mean, they've been the leading voice on protecting these areas, and they also said that it wasn't about energy.
That was Ryan Zinke, Secretary of the Interior, saying, and I quote him again, "Bears Ears isn't really about oil and gas at all." So, of course, today the New York Times reports oil was central in the decision to shrink Bears Ears Monument, according to internal agency emails. From the start of the Interior...
Then you look at the paper trail from the documents that were kind of considered as part of the decision-making process, and it very clearly was about energy development.
Washington Post reports documents that were accidentally released by the Interior Department show Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke and his aides tailored a report on national monuments to emphasize the potential value and upside of logging, ranching, and energy development on the protected lands.
I mean, different industry groups had sent requests for what areas they wanted access to. The maps are very clear about where the deposits are. And so my thing is just own it. Don't pretend it's for some altruistic purpose. Don't pretend it's because of some ideological, concern about the kind of the role of the federal government compared to the states. Like, this is strictly an industry request, and there's a commitment that was made probably during the campaign, and then they fulfilled that commitment. It cuts against, I mean, at this point, I guess 110 years worth of precedent under the Antiquities Act. There really is only one other example of a significant reduction in a monument, and that was when Woodrow Wilson during the First World War was concerned about not having enough timber for the Navy, and so he was going to allow some additional use in Olympia National, what is now in Olympia National Park in Washington State. But there aren't examples of this over the past half century. The actions speak louder than words. And in every single case, when you look at what the motivating factor is, you're kind of using like Occam's razor, right? The simplest solution is the most obvious, right? Like, the simple solution is that there were folks that wanted to extract different minerals and resources, and that they got what they wanted. And this is a case that plays out over and over and over again.
Now, is this a similar kind of thing that we're seeing with the sage grouse and land that's been protected through agreement with the states to protect this not yet endangered bird, but a bird that's been in decline? What do you think about that?
Sure. So so just a little bit of background. So, I mean, sage grouse is an amazing species. For those of your listeners that haven't had a chance to see this bird, it's definitely worth Googling sage grouse and maybe even doing it on YouTube to see the amazing mating dance they have. Iconic species, part of a 350 species ecosystem in the sagebrush steppe, which is this kind of amazing habitat all the way from Montana and Wyoming down to, Colorado and through Nevada and into the Southwest. And it's a species that's been in decline for years. And there's been a lot of reasons for that. Some of that is energy development, some of that's housing development, some of that's just habitat loss. But the species is in trouble. And there was an incredible effort that was led, starting with Dave Friedenthal, the former governor of Wyoming, Secretary Salazar, who was the former Secretary of the Interior and former senator from Colorado, folks like Matt Mead, just recent governor of Wyoming, Steve Bullock, the former governor of Montana, John Hickenlooper in Colorado, Brian Sandoval, and many others. And these governors that work together with stakeholders from ranchers and farmers to different landowners, to sportsman groups, to conservation groups, to the tribes, the biggest collaborative conservation effort in the history of the country. And Secretary Jewell, after that process, announced that because of this collaborative process and the plans that were agreed to, the sage grouse no longer did not require listing under the Endangered Species Act. It wasn't warranted to list the species. And upon coming into office, this administration said they were going to do a complete review of that agreement, and they argued that there wasn't kind of the bipartisan agreement that there in fact had been. And so they did some things that they cleaned up some areas, but one of the things they did in their rulemaking process as they were kind of going through the plans is they took a lot of activities that were required and they made them voluntary. And the challenge is that if voluntary actions aren't really followed through on in their new scenario, the health of the population of the sage grouse could decline further, which would then require listing under the Endangered Species Act, which would then ultimately require pretty significant restrictions on the use of the land. And so again, it's sort of penny wise and pound foolish, right? And this idea like you have an agreement that has good bipartisanship. There's a few kind of extreme actors that want significant changes because they don't like whatever the broader consensus was, and then you kind of put the entire deal at risk because of trying to appease kind of the most extreme voices. And I think the interesting thing in this particular case is that they had proposed significantly more dramatic changes than they ultimately ended up finalizing because the governor stood up and said, "Hold on, a deal's a deal." And in the West, a handshake matters. And so they were willing to stand up and try to uphold as much of the original deal as they possibly could. And that was a bipartisan pushback they got from governors across the West.
And so the proposal that came from the Trump administration has already been sort of moved forward in this way.
Right. So they proposed some changes. They got a lot of feedback. They're kind of in the process of finalizing that right now. But I think I was just proud to be part of a collaborative effort that when the chips were down, a lot of the governors of both parties said, what, we're going to stand by the original deal. We're going to honor our word because we believe that that having healthy wildlife populations and more predictability for industry is a good thing.
Right, because this wasn't just, it was ostensibly to protect the sage grouse, but there was also a lot of other, many other species and habitats being protected there under the sage grouse's umbrella, sort of. Is that?
Well, absolutely. So there's 350 species. I mean, when folks sing about the deer and the antelope roam, and then talking about mule deer and pronghorn. This is that iconic sagebrush, that green kind of underbrush environment, and so it supports a huge range of species.
And one other one that you mentioned was the Trump administration's plan for offshore drilling along all the coast, pretty much. So where do we stand with that? Where is that in process?
Yeah, so the Trump administration near the beginning announced they were going to do open up all federal waters, and they began a little bit of a process. It was somewhat politicized with individual governors kind of for being given exemptions and things like that. But we're waiting. We actually thought the plan was going to come out in December, and it didn't. And so we've seen governors, every single governor on the East Coast at this point, I think with the exception of the new governor of Georgia, has come out against the drilling off the Atlantic coast. So this is completely bipartisan that the governors have stood up and said that this absolutely should not happen. And so I think now the governors are waiting to see if the administration listens to their requests. And so we've been pushing hard. We've been millions of our members have been engaged in this, very concerned about the impacts on wildlife, on local coastal communities, on water quality. And so, we're going to keep, pushing hard, but at this point, we're still in a little bit of a wait and see mode. But I think the news will likely come out, fairly soon after the shutdown is resolved.
Any predictions on that one? Do you think the administration will be able to push this through, at least in some areas?
I think they're going to stay away from most of the Atlantic coast. I think that the massive, overwhelming opposition from governors in both parties, I think they were surprised by. And I think the politics have changed. I think, 10 years ago, I think there were even, some Democrats and moderate Republicans that, said as long as it's far enough offshore, that might be okay. I think that's changed a lot because of some of the disasters the last few years. It would not be wise to propose any expansion on the East Coast, or for that matter, in the Pacific, because I think there's significant opposition in California, Oregon, and Washington as well. This administration often says they're going to let states be in the decision-making role. They say they're going to defer to states' rights, and this is one of those cases where the states could not be more clear on what they're saying. And I think we're hopeful that they'll listen to the governors.
And so David Barnhart, a deputy at the Department of Interior, has been tapped, at least temporarily, to replace Ryan Zinke now that he has stepped down. He's a former fossil fuel lobbyist. What do you think about him as the replacement, and who would you like to see long term in there? Is there any talk of someone who maybe is what you had initially anticipated from Ryan Zinke, someone who was balancing industry interests with maybe more interests of sportsmen and people who are advocates for public lands?
Yeah, so we've had the chance to work with Acting Secretary Bernhardt for a long time, going back to his time during the Bush administration. We've obviously have plenty of disagreements on the energy dominance strategy. And, we want to see a lot more conservation. We do think that whether it is, Secretary Bernhardt or another nominee, that we really want to make sure that the Secretary really bears in mind the lessons of the last 18 months, which is that the American people aren't going to sit kind of idly by as their natural resources are kind of sold to the highest bidder, and that there has to be balance. Because at the end of the day, the mission of the Department of Interior is to make sure that we are stewarding our natural resources for not just short-term gain, but for the long-term benefit of the country. And so, I think there's been different names that have been suggested. There's some folks that are kind of seen as very, very anti-conservation, and there's some folks, and kind of even in some cases in favor of selling kind of public lands to the highest bidder. There's been other folks that are have a more moderate track record, but at this point, we just want to make sure that they're fulfilling the mission of the department. Right now, we're seeing damage to our national parks and refuges because of the government shutdown and not having enough staffing and the rangers and the wardens to make sure that these public treasures are being taken care of. It's absolutely heartbreaking, and so we want to make sure that the public continues to remain vigilant, and that hopefully the administration will realize that it's not just good it's not just good policy; it's actually good politics to be better stewards of the land that we all care about.
And this may be going back a little bit, but I just want to say it sounds like you almost think that, this hasn't been, while some of the proposals have been somewhat of a disaster in terms of people who want to protect public lands from energy development, that on the ground there was the shrinking of the monuments, but there hasn't been as much actually on the ground damage as people maybe feared when they saw some of the proposals coming out of this administration. Am I catching you right?
Yeah, sort of. So a lot of the proposals they do take years, right? So like last year, the United States Congress kind of voted to allow drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Now, the amount of work that has to go into has to occur before that can happen is pretty substantial. Like there's testing, there's leasing. There's a range of permitting activities. And what you're seeing from this administration is just, going through this process as fast as humanly possible, cutting corners in many cases, because their goal is just to, have drilling occur as fast as possible. So even though, we may not see drilling for another year, I think it's going to take longer than that because of a combination of litigation and a lack of market demand. But the impacts of the decisions of the Secretary Zinke's tenure will be felt for years and years to come. I mean, there's a proposal open right now that would extend a series of mining permits in the headwaters of the boundary waters in northern Minnesota. They're taking comment on it right now. This was a decision that the last administration had said that the permits had expired, or the leases had expired, and they weren't going to go forward. The current administration decided to kind of breathe life back into those, and this would be sulfuric acid mining. This is an area you can't even take boats into because the potential of having a small discharge could screw up the alkalinity and the wildlife in one of the most pristine wilderness areas in the world. Again, so even though we're not seeing the impacts today on the ground in some of these places, the wheels are in motion to have damage in these places for decades to come. I mean, there's leasing that occurred in the petrified forest in Arizona. There's been, a continued push to have uranium mining in the same watershed as kind of just outside the Grand Canyon. There was millions of acres that have been leased in places like New Mexico and West Texas, as well as in Alaska. And so again, even though, that doesn't happen immediately because there's a process you have to go through and there's a kind of a mobilization and a lot of steps, that damage is a result of this energy dominance strategy that almost always came at the expense of conservation.
All right. Well, Collin O'Mara, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for everything you guys are doing.
Collin O'Mara is president of the National Wildlife Federation, and this is Trump on Earth. You can find us online at trumponearth.org or wherever you listen to podcasts. Jump on Earth is a production of the Allegheny Front, covering the environment in Pennsylvania. Our show is produced by Andy Cubis. I'm Julie Grant.